Welcome to the Entangled Show, a weekly conversation where we bridge the gap between high-level physics and everyday reality. I'm your co-host, Pete Codella, streaming from Utah's Salt Lake Valley.
And I am Sumit Parashar. I'm from Bhilai and live in Lehigh. I live in two places at once, just like a quantum particle. I coined the term Quantonomy, which is what this show is all about. Thanks for joining us.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Entangled Show. We have a guest with us today, and thrilled to have a conversation, the three of us. To get started, I'll share that our guest today comes because one of our listeners recommended we invite him, and he graciously said yes. So Brandon Severin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, chaps. Great to be on.
Sumit, last time we talked about quantum computers' structure and using a giant freezer to keep things colder than deep space. And Brandon's focus on semiconductor scaling is a cool technical follow-up to help us address how industry experts expect to shrink systems and make them more stable. So I think that's going to be a cool conversation for us. Anything, Sumit, from your perspective before we dive in?
Yeah, I'm excited to hear Brandon's story when it comes to quantum. So Brandon, our show is basically about quantum. We've named it Entangled Show, which is a behavior of quantum. But more importantly, we are going after real world use cases of quantum. And so the objective being, how can we incorporate quantum technologies in the economy? That's the long-term goal. And so to do that, we have creatively come up with a fusion word that has quantum and economy built into it. So our driving force here is Quantonomy. We've created that word so we can bring quantum computing and processes to the masses. And that said, we are so really happy to have you on the show and talk about let's geek about quantum on this show. So good to have you here.
And Brandon is the co-founder of Conductor Quantum. It's a Y Combinator-backed startup, and we know that you studied at Oxford. Talk to us about your company and your experience from researching at Oxford to where you are today, Brandon.
Sure. So at Conductor, we build AI software to operate quantum computers and use them for scientific discovery. Now, what that means in terms of operation is actually building the low-level sort of operating system of these machines. And then for scientific discovery, it's then going away and using AI to run quantum circuits, discover new quantum algorithms, and run them on real hardware, and then realize those new scientific discoveries. Going back to the use cases, Sumit, that you mentioned. Now, my background, I studied my undergrad at Oxford, so I did material science, and then I stayed on at Oxford to do my PhD, where my PhD title was AI for Quantum Computing in Silicon. That's also where I met my co-founder, Joel. We came from the research group that pioneered AI for quantum computing control. And I can get into why it's so important to actually apply AI to this problem of how to actually control and operate a quantum computer as well later on.
Yeah, Brandon, it seems to me like AI is the intermediate technological step between where we have been to where we want to go with quantum. Is that a good way of looking at it?
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. And I think it's both an intermediate step, an enabler, and then a benefactor too.
Interesting.
That's awesome. So Brandon, thanks for sharing that. One key aspect of your profile is that you were a part of Y Combinator, I think 24 batch. So could you talk a little bit about how you got in touch with Y Combinator. What was your experience there, and how would you guide future startups who want to follow the same path and learn from you on that?
Yeah. So my interaction with Y Combinator, I mean, was really from a thought. So I've been reading Paul Graham's essay. So Paul Graham was and his partner Jessica Livingston. They were founders of Y Combinator, and he's notorious, or I shouldn't say notorious, actually famous for these essays he writes on startup culture and founders and how to build a company. And so I'd been reading those for a while on the internet, and I've just also seen a lot of Y Combinator content on the internet. And then three is that, ironically, or to no surprise, I used many companies' products which were Y Combinator backed. Airbnb being one of those examples, but also not
Very
only
well-known
just-
example.
Right, but also not just Airbnb, but also Rigetti Computing. So funny enough, actually, I knew of Rigetti because they were one of the earliest quantum computing startups ever. And they were the first, that was the first quantum company ever funded by Y Combinator. And we were then the second one, I think. There might have been one in between that was quantum related, but we were at least the second focused quantum company in 10 years since Rigetti that Y Combinator had funded. And how we got in was basically just followed the rubric of fill in online form, get called to interview, do the 10-minute interview, and then we got called that we were in. And I think it sounds kind of strange when you hear that, like, oh, okay, fill in an online form, do a 10-minute interview. But I think Y Combinator, they've just done this so many times. They really know like what to look for in terms of traction and startups, but not only that, but really founders. I think at the end of the day, they understand that ideas change, but the founders really are the ones that, push to the end and drive the company.
How detailed was that online form? 10 minutes does not seem like a lot of time to spend with entrepreneurs.
Yeah, the form, so actually you can see the form is public, like anyone can go and see it. Ironically, I think the questions are very simple, but therefore the form ends up being more detailed than it seems. Because if you cannot answer the basic questions in simple terms and with concise answers, then you probably aren't really onto something, or you don't have full conviction on your idea. And so it's things like, what are you building? Like how we started this conversation, and how does it work? How will you make money? Who are your competitors in terms of the idea? And then they ask you about the founder, which is like, what's your background? Name me or give an example of a time where you hacked a system. And it's, these questions, it doesn't sound like, oh, wow, like it's, tell me the exact moment when you knew quantum computing was your passion or something like that, right? Like they're actually very simple questions, but they can be very revealing in terms of the answers. And it's something I saw in our application and also many others, because I help other companies. They reach out to me like, oh, you got in, can you help us with our application? Can you give it a once over? And you see a lot revealed, funnily enough, in just those simple questions and how they're answered.
Yeah, more often than not, a successful entrepreneur is someone who has been a failed entrepreneur dozens of times. So it sounds like they're looking for how you react, how you think through challenges.
Yeah, precisely. And I'd actually argue that even just filling in the form makes your company better. Because it just makes you go back to first principles of like, what are we building? Why are we doing this? How big can this get? How much money can we make? And how ambitious actually are we in this endeavor? Because we have to remember that Y Combinator at the end of the day is a venture capital fund. And they want, they want to back venture capital like businesses and venture capital like founders.
Yeah. Well, Brandon, in our last episode, Sumit and I mapped out some different qubit types, and we
Yeah.
talked about IBM and Google and Microsoft. And the question for you, you focus on operating quantum computers on semiconductor chips. Talk about that approach and like what's involved in your bet there. What's going to work best?
Yeah, so since we last got introduced, we've actually expanded to now 2 more modalities.
Cool.
So we're not just doing semiconductors, we're doing electrons on helium, and we're also doing superconducting qubits too. But I'll go back to why semiconductors to start with. Really, I mean, this comes with our experience being pioneers in this field, building the early control software for semiconductor chips. And why do people even consider semiconductors as a potential modality? Well, it really comes into the argument for scalability, which is to run certain quantum algorithms at scale, and for them to be useful, we will need thousands, hundreds of millions, in some cases, billions of qubits. And a qubit is an information carrying unit of a quantum computer. And then to realize a system with 1 billion qubits, you then need to make sure you can make a system, right? And it's not just like making the chip, it's also thinking about how do we attach wires to that chip? How cold does it need to be? What size of that chip? How big will that chip actually be? Does it take up the size of a room? Does it take up the size of a football field? Does it take up the size of a small city? And genuinely, if you do the maths on different modalities and how they scale, you know, some technologies you'll see actually, yeah, you will need like a small town, you know, to power them. And the beautiful thing about semiconductor qubits is that they benefit and leverage the $1 trillion traditional semiconductor manufacturing industry for their manufacture, which is these chips should be able to be made on the same lines that make the billions of transistors that power your phone and your computer right now, allowing us to have this call, allowing us to train the world's smartest models we've ever seen, giving birth to the AI revolution. That is what this amazing $1 trillion industry enables. And so can we basically slightly modify that transistor such that we have greater control over how we control current flowing through them, such that that device can then behave in a quantum mechanical way? And that's really the promise of semiconductor qubits, which is we see a world where actually you can fit 1 billion qubits on a tiny chip. And from a manufacturing perspective, that's possible. The problem
makes sense that you would want to leverage existing materials, products, supply channels, manufacturing.
Exactly, because we spent 50 years perfecting this industry, and so okay, we can print these chips, and also the cost too to make this chip. You know, at scale, you're looking at a penny per chip realistically, right? Once you've got the recipe dialed in. The problem comes with, well, here's my silicon quantum chip, and you tell me it'll have 1 billion qubits, but when I turn it on, or when I send voltages to each one of these individual gates on my transistor, or my single electron transistors, now it doesn't work. And then the question is, well, why doesn't it work? And it's like, well, the voltages you need to apply are kind of different for each individual gate and individual transistor. And then you say, well, why is it different? Why can't I just apply 1 volt here, 1 volt here, 1 volt here, like we do in classical computing? And then the response is, well, because you're trying to build a qubit, you're literally trying to realize a qubit in the system. And the response is, yeah, well, what's my qubit? It's an individual electron. And so that means that when you try to isolate one electron, you can imagine that one electron in your tiny transistor is going to be sensitive to any impurity nearby, any manufacturing defect, any noise on the voltage you apply to this chip. And so they're really sensitive. There's this problem of device variability between devices as well as over time. The device just naturally drifts. And so you have to calibrate and finely tune the voltages you apply to this silicon quantum chip just to get it working before you can even use the thing. And here's the crux, which is for the past how many years, people have been doing this manually, where they sit there and in the lab, and I did this during the first 2 weeks of my PhD, where I sat there finally calibrating voltages to apply to a silicon quantum chip. And it took weeks to optimize. I mean, we've seen some cases where it took us months to realize 1 qubit in our silicon device. And so the question then says, well, you told me we need 1 billion of these qubits and it takes you months to make 1 work.
Yeah.
So then we need an automatic way of calibrating those voltages. And that was the topic of my PhD. And that's how the company started.
Makes sense. So Brandon, I have a couple of questions along the lines of what you said. In terms of familiarity, we are pretty familiar with semiconductor-based devices. So, I have electrical engineering background, and so with the solid-state devices, with your PNP and NPN kind of transistors, we were really happy in that world for a long, long time. The difficulty, I think, we will have going forward, not to negate the concept that you're working on in any way. We are engineers, and so we're just trying to come up with potential points where there could be friction. Is that with PNP, NPN gates, it is possible to create or simulate the transistor scenario, and that reflects in the gates that we build with those gates, with those transistors. However, with quantum, we are in a very different paradigm. Is that you are replicating behavior of particles at the quantum level. And then we have this uncertainty principle, is that you have solid state and you have quantum, at which point in time it starts to show quantum behavior is driven by the uncertainty principle. And so I'll have to learn a bit more and wrap my head around this. But have you found a solution? And Pete, this is like, too deep into stuff, but I think some of our viewers will be interested in the discussion. Is that to have a solid state based device exhibit quantum behavior?
Yeah.
Have you kind of run into issues along those lines? Is that something that you're familiar with?
Yes. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful things ever. When you do, this is what got me hooked. Was there I was attaching the wires to a chip, literally wire bonding, plugging it into this fridge and cooling it down, and then measuring the current flowing through and sweeping a voltage. And instead of seeing just the turn-on curves at like you would at room temperature, when you cool these things down and you calibrate the voltages, you start to see peaks in current. So a peak and a trough and a peak and a trough. And the gap between those peaks signify you adding an individual electron into your this puddle of electrons that you formed underneath your gate. And it's hard to do. But we've been doing it now as human beings for more than a decade, and now automatically for a few years at Conductor. The other thing is it encroaches on this world of basically what's known as a quantum dot. That's effectively in terms of the solid state physics, what you're forming is a quantum dot. And that's defined as basically a nanoscale structure with a 0-dimensional density of states. And you may be familiar with the idea of like a particle in a box in terms of solid state physics. And effectively what you're building is this particle in a box, and each particle is an electron and it has energy states. And the only way you can access, and I think here's the crux, right? Which is the only way you can access these energy levels and this control over a solid state system is if you cool it down. And so these silicon chips operate at very low temperatures.
Yeah, what temperature are we talking about? I know it's very, very cold.
Yeah, it's cold. And I'll give you 2 points of information here. It's cold, but not as cold as superconducting qubits. So superconducting qubits operate at 10 millikelvin. So, and to give you context, outer space is about 3 Kelvin in temperature. Silicon or semiconductor spin qubits, they can operate at around 1 Kelvin, 1.5 Kelvin. We've seen even hotter temperatures at 4 Kelvin. I mean, they work great at 10 millikelvin too, but actually one of the papers that came out during my PhD, which ended up being published in Nature, was showing that we could do control and initialization of these qubits in a silicon chip at 1.5 Kelvin. And it was considered a hot qubit. It's considered a hot temperature because it's orders of magnitude hotter than what had been shown previously, which is 10 or so millikelvin. And the reason why you need to cool it down, Sumit, is so you can access these individual electron levels. That's how you access the quantum world, such that the thermal noise doesn't take over your quantum world and the device behaves classically, to round out the answer there.
Well, let me ask another question, something we've been discussing in previous episodes, an upcoming quantum cliff and how encryption will change on the internet. And what we've seen is benchmarks and predictions around 2029, 2030. Talk to us a little bit, Brandon, about how realistic that is, how achievable it is that for universal fault-tolerant quantum computing.
Yeah, this is great. I was just on the call earlier and people I was saying to them, yeah, there's estimations I'll be like 2028, I think 2030 just to be safe. And they're like, no way, la, 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 la. And I was like, well, it's not just me saying this. Okay, cool. I think, it's not impossible. And I think with these things, the probability increases with time, but also the probability, I think, skyrockets after 2030. That, if you treat life as a series of probabilities, in terms of statistical mechanics, and you think that way, I think it's like 0 until 2028, and then after 2029, it just like goes through the roof. And here's the reasoning is, you shouldn't extrapolate lines, but if you do, there is a very clear trend, which is the size of quantum computers being built has been increasing with time. Yeah, I mean, 5 or so years ago, like the largest machine had maybe a couple 100 qubits ever demonstrated. Just last year, like late last year, a amazing researcher, Dr. Hannah Manech at Caltech, demonstrated her ability to realize 6,100 qubits.
Wow.
Now, they weren't used in a computational sense. She didn't do an algorithm or anything. She just realized individual qubits, of which collectively there were 6,100. And we could, I think, take a step back and think, well, first of all, well done, Hannah, but also two, like, wow, right? As you said, 6,100 qubits in a single system. Then the other line you need to plot is how many qubits do we need to break RSA? And we've already touched on this.
Define RSA for our audience.
Okay, very good point. And RSA is Rives, Shamir, and Alderman, I think is the names it stands for. Basically, a bunch of amazing cryptographers that came up of a way of doing public-private key cryptography, which effectively secures the world as we know it. All communication channels, your connection to the internet, your connection over the phone, bank transfers, details, nuclear codes. It's all RSA in terms of that communication channel. WhatsApp messages, for example. And I can get into more detail the history of that, but that aside, I'll ramble forever. And the number of physical qubits required to break RSA has been decreasing over time. You might say, well, how does it decrease? I thought you told me we need 1 billion. And that's true. Depending on how good your qubits are, if they're not that good, you'll need 1 billion qubits. And that was research done many years ago, back in like 2010, 2012 by Austin Fowler, Andrew Cleland, and co. But then human beings put their brain together and they said, well, how can we kind of compile this algorithm to break RSA such that we need fewer and fewer qubits? Because they thought building 1 billion qubit machine is going to be hard. Let's actually think, can we optimize the code? And over time they did. And then, you know, a few years later, someone says, okay, we'll only need 100 million. It's better than 1 billion. And then a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, a team at Google came out and said, we'll need 1 million qubits. And we were like, oh, okay, we're getting warmer. And then a couple of months ago, Google said maybe 500,000 if we compile this code. And then that same month, a researcher by the name of Madeleine Kane, who's now a company called Oratomic, said, well, look, we could probably do this with 12,000 qubits. And here's how. And the advantage is, one, the hardware you run it on, going back to how good is the qubit quality, but not only how good is the qubit, but also can those qubits talk to each other over long distances? Can you get qubit A to talk to qubit B as well as qubit E in the chain and move them and chat to them? Allows you to then use fewer and fewer qubits to solve this very large problem. You're transferring information as well as savoring mistakes. It makes it easier to correct for errors if qubits can communicate over longer distances. Because you can basically say, this qubit has an error, but I've kind of encoded the information over there and it's safe. Let me just double check. Okay, we can fix that problem. And the name of this code is known as a low density parity check code, QLDPC. And they showed, yeah, in theory, you could do it with 12,000 qubits if you run on an architecture that allows you to do this long range connectivity. Funnily enough, known as a neutral atom architecture, so different to silicon spin qubits, which is also the same architecture that our previous amazing researcher, Hannah Manich, realized 6,100 qubits in. So now you think, oh, are you telling me we're 6,000 qubits away from breaking RSA? And the answer is, yeah, kind of, probably, yeah. Now, there's a lot to happen. It's not just realizing the qubits. There's a lot of engineering challenges, as I said, like getting them to talk to each other and making sure the machine stays, again, calibrated. You can correct for the errors. So all this low-level control is important. But then it puts it into perspective that, yeah, 2030 is possible. It is possible.
Let me summarize that, and then we'll have Sumit follow up with another question. But it feels and seems like over time, we see adoption of technology happen faster and quicker. Things advance faster, more quickly. Now we have AI. It just makes sense that you've got an exponential speed that it's hard to predict. But we could actually get there sooner than we currently think we could.
Well, props to you, Pete, because none of these advancements used AI. It was just It was just human ingenuity. And that's really actually the bet of our company, which is, okay, now wait till we start applying AI to these problems.
Yeah.
Not just on the calibration and control of these systems, but on the actual like algorithm discovery and compilation. I think we're going to see an acceleration of this field like we can't even imagine, quite
Makes sense.
frankly.
Good to hear. So I will just go back to the quantum cliff discussion for a second, and then we'll come back to the core topic of the day, which is AI and quantum. Is that so? We've actively been working on spreading the word about quantum cliff. We've been actively tracking, the pushback on the dates that Google, IBM, and now Microsoft have been making. Microsoft announced Majorana 2 a couple of weeks back, and so they said by 2029, Satya Nadella said that by 2029, we'll have general availability of Majorana 2. So that pushes the date back. Google's Willow, a few years back, if you had checked with Google, they would say, hey, your Q day or quantum day is 10 years ahead. And then Sundar Pichai actually announced that by mid 2029, their Willow will be generally accessible. With IBM, we've been able to log in to their machines and run Qiskit-based experimentation. So all of these behemoths, like multi-billion-dollar companies, are now pushing the day back into us. And you're right, is that as we have more stable qubits, we will kind of run into the possibility that pending Q day, all the encryption, RSA, you mentioned ECC is another one, is that they'll end up picking RSA and ECC. And we are actually working at a grassroots level to bring awareness to this issue. But yeah, thanks for your endorsement on that issue. We will carry that message back to Utahns. The topic, when I researched your company, Brandon, the core curiosity I had for you coming into this is that using conjunction of AI and quantum. Like I said before, we did not have the benefit of using AI to research, but now we are talking about autonomous AI that decides the objective or the subject of the white paper that it wants to write and does and does the experiment on. It decides what it wants to do. It goes out and does deep research. Not only searching on the internet, but it may have access to the actual machine where it wants to do research, does that research, and comes back. So that is a scary proposition, in my opinion, is that it's the loop of the AI sitting on a quantum machine. It's a good thing. It will take humanity many steps forward. But I want to hear your opinion and your observations as to how this loop works and whether we can control it or not. And then just want to hear your thoughts about all of that.
Yeah, great point, Sumit. That's my fear too, funnily enough. You'd think as a founder, my fear would be, oh, will this work? How will we get it to work? Funnily enough, actually, I have zero fears that technology won't work. I know it will work. We're seeing it working already. My fear is that actually AI goes and uses this technology for bad things. Generally. And I think that loop is easy to imagine in a primitive form, but I think hard to really grasp in the most grandiose form. And in the near term, it'll be one, figuring out what are the algorithms required to, let's say, solve a drug discovery problem, or like part of that drug discovery chain. And that could be, for example, solving the protein binding affinity problem, which has plagued biochemists and computational biologists for many years because of the lack of training data and so on. Whereas with a quantum computer, in theory, you can simulate these molecules exactly and look how they interact. But we don't have the program to do that yet, nor do we have the machine. But even if we had the machine, we wouldn't have the actual program to run. And so I think the first case is then AI going away and discovering the right code, the right program to build, figuring that out, almost iterating along. Here's the problem I want to solve. Here's the machine you can use to solve that problem. Figure out the language I need to make that machine work and solve my problem. Kind of like
Brandon,
how
before you bring up your next point, I just want to interject your comment about concern that how AI may use the technology. I think it's fair to state that we should also be concerned about how humans or governments or others may use the technology. That is the big question mark. And how do you protect our planet?
Yeah, very, very true. Because this is dual use, right? At the end of the day. And I can get onto that in much more detail. Yeah, I had the luck of going to quite a few like AI and ethics lectures of the future of Humanity Institute led by Nick Bostrom at Oxford, and it is a major problem. But yeah, so I do see AI in this kind of like early R&D discovery phase, but will be critical to then enabling these use cases, which is how do we write the code to make these machines useful for a specific use case? And then you solve that use case, then you move on to the next one in the drug discovery chain. Like, okay, we know how this protein will bind, then can we figure out how to manufacture it at a more energy effective cost basis, right? Maybe we can maybe we can generate enzymes to help manufacture this protein. So then you go into the enzyme discovery and point of this drug life cycle. And bit by bit, we start to build up this corpus of knowledge. And much of that knowledge is not, and I think this is really then going back to the history of AI, the bitter lesson of what we've learned, which is it won't be human led. It'll actually be let AI just kind of go and do its thing, learn from experience. Because we've just seen that always wins out, right? Like AlphaZero beat all these chess champions and Go champions because it just played a lot of Go and chess games. It wasn't because, oh, here's all the moves so-and-so did. It was like, no, just go away, play chess, come back when you're amazing. And I think it'll be this, exactly. And I think it'll be the same with quantum computing and AI using these machines for discovery. And then it'll be like, okay, now I'm good at, let's say, chess and Go. Now I want to go and discover new moves. Right, I want to discover new openings. I want to maybe even make a new game entirely, a new molecule, because I know that it needs to do this binding affinity. It can be made by this enzyme, and so on and so on and so on and forth. And so you build this almost this brain that understands the natural world better than we do. And you see my point, right? So in the beginning, it's very small, and then next thing you know, here we are. There's a new world. There's something that actually understands nature better than we do. And I don't know what that future looks like, quite frankly. Like I can picture it, but like what the world looks like,
We don't know.
Like, is it flying cars then? You already have flying cars. Then it's like, what does it actually look like?
One quick point I want to bring up here is that I recently, so we've been using agents for the last few months, I would say. But then recently, I started using this new platform called Hermes. And if you have an agentic AI platform, so this looks like a deadly combination. If you have a Hermes-like self-learning agent that is let loose with all its might and power, with a quantum computer where it can decide the research topic, build the algorithm, deploy it on the machine, learn from it, and then fine-tune the algorithm. I mean, of course, there'll be some good things that will come out of that too. But like Sable was turned off like one fine morning, and then now it's back on this morning again. So, anyways, so like you said, the future is fantastic and amazing, but we don't know what that looks like at this point.
Yeah. No, that's exactly what we're building at Conductor, actually. what you've described, this sort of self-learning agent. That's exactly what we're building.
Yep. So Pete, we'll wrap up in a second, but Brandon, there was this one specific thing that I wanted to talk to you about. Is you recently did a collaboration with another group, and you experimented with electrons on helium, right? So can you talk to us about what the other company was, how you collaborated with them, and what was your inference from those experiments?
Yeah, we worked with this amazing company who's now a customer of ours, AeroQ. They're based in Chicago, and they're building quantum computers based on electrons on helium. That is their technology. So instead of, let's say, having your qubit be an electron inside the silicon chip, what they do is they take the silicon chip with the gate electrodes and everything, but then they cover it with a layer of superfluid helium. And then they put their qubit, their electron, on top of that layer of superfluid helium. And you might say, well, why? And it goes back to my point about device variability, which is that layer of superfluid helium almost acts as like a barrier to protect that electron from any noise or defects it might see from the
insulator.
Raw, exactly, from the raw silicon underneath. And once again, it still benefits from the silicon manufacturing techniques, but then has the perks of this helium layer that should give a longer qubit lifetime. And, you know, the AeroQ is this amazing team where they probably have the best electron on helium scientists in the world at that company, like genuinely. Like they literally have the person who saw one of the first single electron transport on that system ever. But for them, the day-to-day, they do a lot of manual work, a lot of manual tuning. And so what we did was we went in and deployed our models to then help them calibrate their systems automatically. But not only that, was we also partnered up with AeroQ as well as NVIDIA to test a large language model, one of the NVIDIA Nemotron models, to then control the experiment autonomously, so an autonomous quantum lab. And this ended up becoming the icing calibration model, which led to a paper that we published with NVIDIA and AeroQ and a few national labs across the US, where we basically built and integrated with our collaborators a model that can then run experiments and control a quantum computer just like a quantum engineer would. And so that was really great fun to do. It was amazing to come back. It's like, I remember doing this manually as a quantum engineer. And then instead of now, you know, having this procedure, it's like, no, like just run this experiment. You type it in the box and the agent goes away and does it and then returns the results. And under the hood, you know, it's integrated with our models and the AeroQ hardware. And it was one of the most amazing sights to see, actually, because then, you know, when we say these things like, oh, an agent running its own experiments and understanding from experience and everything, you realize actually, yeah, it's not that far off. It can happen once the infrastructure is there to enable that future.
Beautiful. Pete, go ahead and wrap us up.
That's cool. Brandon, we know you've got a busy schedule and some other appointments this afternoon. In less than 60 seconds, tell us, what does the ecosystem of quantum computing need the most? Is it capital? Is it collaboration? Is it more AI? You know, more cowbell? What's needed the most?
All three. All three, actually. I think, and here's the reason. It needs more AI because it's just an accelerant, and we're seeing it like as a team of three, we worked with 3 different qubit modalities in 6 months.
Wow.
Most people work with one type of their entire career. Right? And that's because we built the infrastructure to leverage ourselves with AI, and we're building AI systems that run these experiments autonomously. But then to do that, you need capital. right? But then also to demonstrate those systems, you need collaborators like AeroQ, like Semicon, for example. And so it's a combination of all three. And then, you know, the elephant in the room here is like, all these things cost money. And I think when you do the cost basis analysis of what it costs to build a quantum computer, depending on the modality type, you realize it's a very expensive endeavor, like billions of dollars.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see how it plays out. Brandon, tell our listeners how they can find out more information about Conductor Quantum or how to reach you.
Yeah. Find us at conductorquantum.com. You can actually give our agent a try. So you can go to our website and type in, help me break, I don't know, Sumit's passwords, for example, and we will.
Oh boy.
No, I'm joking. Our agent will say, no, I'm not allowed to do that. But you can do maybe a toy problem, like help me break a 4-bit password, or help me simulate lithium hydride, for example. And our agent Qoda will build a quantum circuit for you and then allow you to run it on any quantum computer in the world. So just like that, from a natural language prompt, you've basically run your first quantum circuit without needing a PhD in quantum computing. And so I really encourage people to give that a try, just so they actually get a feeling of what this technology can do now, what its potential is, and our agent will answer your questions, and it can be very educative in that manner. But then obviously the usual social channels, LinkedIn and Twitter, Brandon Severin on both, and Conductor Quantum on both of those too. We do many of these talks and podcasts, and feel free to reach out by email. You know, I read everything. I try and respond to everything. So always happy to chat and learn more about people's interests, but just discuss quantum too.
Cool.
Well, and
So
you did respond to us. We appreciate that.
And we'll have a slide out there that has your information, your company's logo, and your information. So we'll definitely have that out there. And if someone ends up breaking my password, I'll have to call you.
Yeah. No. You got me there. You got me there.
Brandon, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For joining us.
Yeah.
Take care. Thanks, chaps.
Okay.
That was a fascinating conversation.
Yes, Pete. It actually went deeper than I was expecting. We were talking about the commercial aspects and, you know, the generic way of managing qubits, modalities, and stuff like that. But this gentleman, brought up some really good points. And your discussion with him about the post-quantum cryptography, what is RSA, what is ECC, I think that was amazing. And I really wish that by doing this, we are opening up doors between people who are interested in quantum here in Utah versus Brandon. And of course, he's going to be connected with a lot of other people in California and in Chicago. So I think we have done good today. And I love this person's demeanor. He was a techie, but he was pretty open, and I loved his communication skills too.
It was a good recommendation, and I'll just do a shout out to any of our listeners, as they run across people in the quantum space, feel free to send those ideas our way, because I think this conversation will bring a lot of value to what we're trying to do with the podcast to help people understand quantum, what's coming, what the timeline looks like, what the barriers are, the challenges, and also the opportunities. And like I mentioned, if you look back on technology and just its accelerated pace of coming into our world and changing things, and I mean, now everyone has a smartphone, right? And a handful of years ago, maybe not. Things change fast, things change quickly, and quantum is going to be an exponential leap forward when it does arrive. And to think that it could feasibly happen in this decade before we hit 2030 is just kind of mind-blowing.
It is, absolutely.
The Entangled Show podcast is available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Please like and subscribe to the pod. Connect with us at entangled.show or send an email to info@entangled.show. I'm Pete Codella. Thanks for listening.
And I am Sumit Parashar, signing off for now. Thanks again for joining us here at the Entangled Show. We'll see you next time.